It is really good to be here, and particularly good to be off the road at this point. I'd like to find out who my audience is to begin, so maybe I can hear a little bit. So it's clear that we've got some students. How many are art students? Okay. How many are music students? Okay, so we've got some students that are general interest, I guess. What?
And lots of engineering.
Engineering. What brings you to this particular talk? Just general interest?
Yeah, I like music. I'm in
We're all,
band.
we're all
Okay.
residents of a community on campus called the Arts Village. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so we all definitely have interests in art if we don't study it.
Okay, fantastic. And then we've got, I'm assuming people who knew Vernon Pratt. How about a show of hands, folks that knew Vernon? Or how about friends of Debbie's? Are there any other friends of Debbie's? Okay, and then folks that, other folks I'm assuming are art appreciators and people who just want to know a little bit more about this artist and maybe some of the thoughts that I bring to the table tonight. Is that fair? Anybody really unique to any of those ideas that they're going, wait a second, you missed my group?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm the father of one of your students about 10 years ago.
Yep, I appreciate you making that clear, and we once in a while we'll have parents of alumni show up at different things that I do, and that's always fun to have something close to family. Yeah.
I think you're from Jimmy Stewart's hometown.
I absolutely am from Jimmy Stewart's hometown of Indiana, Pennsylvania. In fact, my dad, long before I was around, would go into his father's hardware store to buy hardware and often see Jimmy hanging out as a kid around the place. So yeah, that definitely that's my hometown. Do you have a Pennsylvania connection?
No, I just know more things like that.
That's important stuff.
And
Well,
Scott,
oh, yeah.
Also, Trinity and John, Debbie and Vernon's kids are coming, but they are also late
Yeah,
in traffic.
and that's important. It's actually part of my opening remarks. Is that this is important for me on a number of levels, to be honest. And I'll tell you a little bit as we get started about my relationship to Vernon Pratt and his artwork. But over the years, I've developed a relationship with his children, and I was expecting them to be here. I'm sure they're caught in the same traffic that I was caught in. So we'll introduce them when they come in to make sure that you know who they are. Well, let's go ahead and get started on the content. I'm just going to move this stuff so I don't trip. I've got a couple of goals for today. I was thinking about there's nothing worse than going to a talk and kind of wondering, well, what exactly does this speaker want me to walk away from? What should the takeaway be? Well, the two goals would be the following. That number one, I want you to know a little bit more about Vernon Pratt and his artwork. And we're going to look at a number of images of his artwork. I brought a couple of things that I pulled from the warehouse just to sort of use as demonstration pieces to some extent. So when you walk away today, I want you to feel like you have a good sense of this prolific artist and his seasons of creation. And so that would be number one. And then number two, I want you to walk away with an understanding of what made this musician grab onto his work. Because when I'll tell you sort of in detail as we go, but when I was introduced to this mass of artwork in the warehouse that you'll hear about as we go through the day, I was drawn to it in ways that really spoke to me as a teacher at the School of Science and Math, because there's so much math involved, there's so much order and system involved in his progression as an artist that I wanted to take that to my students. And as a pedagogue who's always looking to create systems that work for my students to learn about music, how to perform music, and how to, frankly, think about music, I'm always developing systems, and I made a connection with Vernon Pratt because he was into systems. And so these two things, and then how that relates to music, ultimately. Here's what you won't get. You won't get, I'm not an art educator. I'm not a visual artist. I'm a guy who digs artwork at every level. I was first introduced to the world of fine art by my college roommate, who was an art major, a graphic design major, but he sort of introduced me to the world of receptions and exhibitions. It was really enlightening to see what these artists were able to put on a canvas or into a sculpture and to create. And it was sort of the beginning of me viewing myself as a creator, as an artist, musician. Yes, musicians can feel a little bit like technicians at times, especially classical musicians. And so this kind of was a big part of my, my development as an artist. A little bit of history, just to get you up to speed with how I get here. In 2013, one of our engineering instructors at the school, named John Morrison, came to me in a lot of enthusiasm, and he said, "Hey, Scott, have you ever heard of Vernon Pratt?" And I hadn't. And he said, "Well, I do Pilates with his widow, Debbie." And he said, "I've gotten to know her, and she's just the greatest person, and she's taking me to this warehouse to see this massive artwork by her deceased husband, and I'm wondering if you'd like to go." We had just started doing these little minor exhibits in the lobby of the auditorium of the School of Science and Math, and I was seeking out neat stuff to put up on the walls. I was doing it just because I walked through those halls every day, and I thought it was too good of a space to not have artwork. And so I just started doing these exhibits and holding receptions, and this seemed like a neat opportunity to learn about another artist. So he and Debbie and I, along with, if I'm remembering right, the head of our foundation at the school, we went to this warehouse outside of Durham, kind of a real industrial-looking place. And I remember Debbie, unlocking the padlock and opening the door. And first thing she said was, "Look out for rattlesnakes." And that sort of set the tone. It was a cold day, it was late fall, and we were in this dark, huge mass of a space with it just seemed like everywhere I looked, there was another piece to look at. And I was immediately struck by the geometric subject matter. And so we started looking, and I'm just delighted by the things that I saw, and it was way too much to take in. And some of these art pieces were maybe some of the larger ones might be 16 feet by 8 feet. I mean, they're huge. And then there's others that are much smaller, of course, but he worked in large sizes for sure. And I started learning more about him. Debbie was sort of all personality and very, very fun to talk to and get to know. And so we just made friends throughout the day, and I got real excited about the possibility of doing this exhibit at the School of Science and Math. And so we began talking. Well, during the course of the day, or maybe, I can't remember, it might have been even a week afterwards, I got a call from my friend Stella Sieber, who's right here. And Stella said, "Hey, I understand that you and Debbie Pratt have made a connection. And I think you called me. Do you recall, Stella? I think that's how it went." And Stella and I have been friends for now 16 years, and at the time, I guess maybe 13 years. And I thought, wow, what a great connection. And from there on, the relationship sort of had a neat little triangle between Stella and Debbie and myself, right up to the time when Debbie passed away just about a year ago. And so that was a nice little triangular friendship that developed. And it definitely made me even kind of be a little bolder with what I was doing with these exhibits, because Stella encouraged me, certainly. We did our first exhibit at the School of Science and Math in 2014, put it up in the late winter, as I recall, and it was an exhibit of a lot of the geometric works. And if you go over to Mamandi Hall, to the exhibit that's there right now, several of the pieces that are on display there now are pieces that were in our exhibit at the School of Science and Math. I wish I had better pictures of that exhibit to show you. Somewhere down the line, I couldn't find them. And trust me when I tell you, I've done a lot of digging for old stuff to find it. Those pictures I didn't find, but many of the pieces that are up in the current exhibit were up in our halls as well. During the time of that exhibit, which was really well received, and it was really great that the students at the school really, I think, embraced the numerical and geometrical concepts that are in these pieces. Stella called me again, and she said, "Scott, we've got this, but I've got even something better, kind of in holding. And I asked her what that was, and it was essentially a full exhibit of works built around the theme of John Coltrane, and which really gets me to one of the important things about Vernon Pratt that you need to know, and that he absolutely adored the music of John Coltrane. He's a saxophone player. Pratt was a saxophone player. Coltrane's a sax player, and he just was moved by Coltrane's music. He was moved by Coltrane's person, and so he had this wonderful collection of essentially variations on Coltrane's image from 1967 that we exhibited just last school year, and that was up all last academic year at our school. And kind of one of the neat things was we built our whole fall curriculum around themes of John Coltrane, so everything from My Favorite Things to Equinox and others. So that it became a great jumping off point for us at the school. Okay. We're going to focus today, as you can see here, on 4 decades and phases of Vernon Pratt's work. The 60s we'll sort of call the form years, and later in the 60s he moved to black, white, and gray, and I found a lot of quotes of gray as a color, and we'll talk a little bit of that as we go, because you're going to see these gradations of gray are really, really important. I'll just make a quick introduction of Trinity and John Pratt as they come in. We're glad to see you guys. Welcome.
Fresh off the plane from Philly.
Yeah.
Coming in from Atlanta.
I mean, there's been a lot of traveling in the last couple of hours. I just walked in right on time, so we're glad you're here. You just missed the introductory remarks, is all.
Thanks for stalling.
Absolutely. So in the 60s, this spinning out of form and the beginnings of black, white, and gray. The 70s we'll call shades of gray. The 80s, all the possibilities of and geometrical patterns. And then the best I could find, in addition to more sort of bold three-dimensional things in the 90s, were these wordplay pieces that I'm going to touch on. What I would say is that Vernon Pratt, if you dig in, has anyone done an internet search on Vernon Pratt? Nobody? Well, I've done a lot of them. Yeah, the 4 of us have. There is, well, actually, Zoe told me when she started doing that the name she was coming up with was mine, and so that really is a very recent relationship and a thin relationship, because I didn't know Vernon, so I really know his family, and so when that's as deep as you can find on the internet, what you learn is that this was a pretty analog guy, and in some of the phone calls that I made and sort of informal interviews that I did with friends and colleagues over the years, what I learned is that Vernon was an analog artist. He never really got over to the digital side. He didn't get to the digital side of promotion. And those of you that know what it is to be an artist now, you have to have a web presence. You have to, or you don't get found. I got found to speak to you today because of my web presence, ultimately. But that never really became part of Vernon's professional life. And as a result, it was a little hard to find things to research, to really understand. Fortunately, with my relationship with the family, I did get my hands on, first of all, names of a few colleagues around the country, which I called and spent some time speaking with. And then the family very generously loaned me some grant proposals where he describes his progression in his own words, which are really neat, and a couple of curators' descriptions of Pratt's work from different exhibits over the years, and even something that I think is fascinating, when he was designing and developing the Thought Seat project, which is essentially outside of Durham Arts Council. This is his notebook, and there's lots of jotted down ideas in the book that kind when you know what's there now, it gets you to there. But I had to really piece a lot of things together. And I think for this talk tonight, I was particularly concerned about the notion that I didn't want to make anything up. I didn't want to make up a connection to music that didn't really exist. I knew what I thought I saw and sensed in his work in terms of musical connections and artistic connections with the music world. But I wanted to be a little bit more authoritative than just what I thought I saw and what I thought I perceived in his creative process. So in reading a bunch of these documents and in talking to friends and colleagues, I really became much more emboldened to make some of the connections that we'll make tonight. So I hope that you find them to be interesting. Some of it might feel a little bit like a music history lecture. That's okay. What I'd really like you to do is to have this sense of the connections that I saw and that I got excited about. So we're going to look at these four areas. Go ahead and take a look at this. This is a quote. I think this is from a grant proposal. I think the things that struck me in this, as I had already made personally some musical connections, and then the phrase, "I'm painting scales," spoke to me in incredible ways. Now, Vernon was a jazz musician, so if you know a little bit about jazz performance, foundationally for jazz, you have to practice scales. You have to sit down and do the rudiments in order to be extemporaneously creative. There's very little that happens on stage in a jazz performance that hasn't been prepared for. Now, the order that things happen or the way one might feel and express at that moment of improvisation can be different every single time. But a jazz musician is typically drawing on their long hours of preparation. And I think, I love to tell a story. I have 3 sons. My youngest son is now 14. But when he was about 6 years old, he was learning to play the violin. And I couldn't get him to stop goofing around when he was practicing the violin. He's sort of a goof anyway, in all the best ways. But he would just kind of goof around and kind of jump around, never really concentrated. And I'd say, "Cale, why don't you get a little more serious when you practice?" And he'd say, "Dad, when you play, you always look like you're having so much fun. I'm just sort of imitating you." And I think we sometimes feel that way when we see jazz. It just looks so off the top of your head. Wow, they're improvising, they're making it up as they go. But in the background is scale study. And the notion that he could accomplish his painting alone and take as long as necessary to do it, for me, sort of gets me back into the practice room. That's where I accomplish the most as a musician. I'm painting scales, and this really emboldened me. There are obvious relationships between my painting and my music. I do a lot of counting for both, and we'll talk about scales here in a minute as we go, and modes. Both are enjoyable, hard work that hopefully look and sound interesting and easy. So this to me was an important quote and one that was worth taking a look at early today. Let me just get myself organized here a little bit more. The musical parallels that we're going to look at in the next half hour or 45 minutes include going all the way back to medieval times to the Gregorian chant. And we'll see some statements that Vernon made getting us back there. Scales and modes, the notion of cycles and orbits. We're going to begin to see this when we look at a lot of his work, that there are cycles and systems that he explores. And so for me as a musician, in looking at his systems, I think of orbits, and I'll explain that a little bit more musically. Form and classicism, serialism, Arnold Schoenberg. How many have heard of Arnold Schoenberg or the notion of serialism before? Okay, we're going to teach you about that a little bit tonight. You're going to leave understanding that a little bit. And then, of course, jazz. And we do sort of have to start and end with jazz when we're talking about Vernon Pratt, because that was the music that he loved. By the way, if the Pratts want to add anything, don't hesitate. If anybody wants to add anything, don't hesitate. Or if you have a question that grows while we're going through this, don't hesitate. But jazz sort of has to be the starting and the ending point, I think, when we're thinking about Vernon. Okay, so we're going to start with form. I found a document that had a curator's view of Pratt's work, and in 1967 he did all these Coltrane pieces, and I want to tell you these were just quick photographs I took of our exhibit through the glass that they were already framed. So these aren't the best photographs in the world, but they're what I had for insurance purposes, and they're out of all of our hands now, so I wasn't able to get better photographs. So bear with me on this. I've got a bunch of these to show you. But these were just before Vernon stepped away from color. And here he talks about human form, and he was very interested in simplified forms. So I equate a lot of these to the notion of a theme and variations in music, where we have some kind of a theme. In this case, the theme is John Coltrane. And then as you look at each of these images I'm about to show you, you'll see a lot of similarities, but they're all unique in their own way. So we'll just go through a couple of them. This is Blue Train, one that he had called Young Train. I might go back and forth just a little bit. There's Blue Train again. Young Train. A Love Supreme is the title of his most famous album. But again, a lot of similarities, bold, broad strokes. Coltrane Study. This is a color piece. I think John has it maybe in his home. Do you have it yet?
I got this.
We used it for our exhibit poster. This I know was his favorite, and it's my favorite as well. Really colorful, a little bit more of the image, has the saxophone there. Now, this one particularly, you note the color, and when we get to the late 60s, really just after that, we see a couple of these phrases come up in his writing and in others writing about him. One is this notion that form is from, and we're going to talk about words just a little bit as we go, but this is a phrase that I've ascertained is pretty important, especially in this early work of Vernon Pratt's. And then the notion of gray as color, and at some point he decides, I'm going to get away from color altogether, and various gradations of gray are going to be my colors, my palette. He said, this is a quote, "Form in art can only exist if there is an origin for it to be from, that the relationships of form can only be appreciated to the extent that the original ideas and materials are recognizable." That's a quote from him in the 60s. So this, the next couple of images are black and white images that were in a kind of a little pamphlet document that I got my hands on. So, and he, in one of his grant proposals, referenced this image of the woman pretty prominently, in fact, as being an important work for him. I think this is Ravi Shankar, the sitar player. I'm not sure specifically who that is. Make sure that I'm up myself here. So these give you a good feel. I'm going to just back up again. A couple of these in gray, a couple of these here. Now, for my money, as I think about form as a musician, when I think about form, I go right to classicism. So I get to thinking of the music of Mozart, the music of Haydn. They're going to be sort of the two quintessential composers. And I personally have had a magnificent relationship with these composers' works, particularly as I get older. Now I want to just kind of characterize how people sometimes think about this music. We're thinking about 1750 to 1825-ish. I've had a number of conversations with both students and music appreciators over the years that'll say, I don't really like Mozart. I don't really like Haydn. It's a little thin for my taste. How many people could say, oh, I'm really familiar with Mozart's maybe piano sonatas or work? Okay, wow. Okay, so a little bit, we're going to dive in a little bit here. What folks that don't really know music history don't understand is that in that era, there was a very specific form that composers were trying to fit their ideas, their melodies, their thoughts into in a simple and beautiful way. When I teach classical music, I use the word poise a lot, and I use the word stability a lot. Composers weren't trying to be avant-garde in that time. They were trying to fit inside the box of form and make something absolutely beautiful that fit inside that box. And there really was the quintessential form of the era was sonata allegro form, which I'm going to teach you about just a little bit here in a second. There's also theme and variations, and there's also rondo form. And I'm going to go kind of quickly through these, but I'll just give you a little taste of each of these. Sonata allegro form looks something like this. There might be a short introduction, and then there are going to be two themes. Let's call them characters in a plot, okay? Theme A and theme B. Typically between the themes there's a big old punctuation mark, an exclamation point or a period that we call a cadence in music. Then those two themes repeat, and we hear them again. Character A, character B, character A, character B. Then in the middle, we have this part called the development, where it's just like developing a plot. Something happens to the themes. The composer takes them and twists them around, changes the key, does something interesting with them. Sometimes that development can be as short as 25, 30 seconds. It doesn't have to be wrong. Sometimes it's longer. And then we hear the theme A and theme B again, some kind of little closing coda, sort of a, okay, that's all, folks, and we're out to the end. So it's a very simple form. And this is what Mozart and Haydn and others of their era were aspiring to do. So this is a little 3-minute Mozart piano sonata in sonata allegro form. I'll bet everyone's heard it. This is the first theme. Second theme is just about over. Repeats back to the beginning again. Pretty simple. So as a listener, you're not overwhelmed here. If this was the first time you were hearing this and you understood sonata allegro form, when it came back to that initial theme, you'd go, I've heard them. I've heard the two characters. Let's hear them again. Sort of tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them. Second theme. And a big part of understanding this music of this era is understanding the form. Otherwise you might go, yeah, it's nice, it's got a nice beat, you know. Okay, now Mozart's going to develop this theme a little bit. Oh, minor key, a little more ominous. We're back home. And see, now we understand it, and it's kind of cute. You kind of go, ah, that was neat how he got us back there. Now we get something a little different. He takes a little bit of liberties here. So even Mozart gets a little bit outside the box. This is pretty wild for this era. Second theme. and a little coda just to get us out of it. And that's that. Now, I've got a couple others, but because we started a little late, I'm just going to say a word about them, and then I'm going to move on, because I really don't want to, I don't want to gloss over the later stuff, which is really where it gets super interesting. Theme and variation is essentially what it is. It's you'll hear a melody. In this case, the one that I've got here, I think, was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and it takes a little time to develop, but then there's all kinds of different variations where you can still hear the tune, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but there's different embellishments all the way around that theme, and it might happen 2, 3, 4, 10 times. I don't know how many variations there are on this particular one. There are a ton. So this particular Twinkle, Twinkle variations is something like 18 minutes long. I wasn't going to play the whole thing for you. But I'm going to keep going just because. Rondo form is another kind of form of the Viennese era where you have a theme, A, a contrasting theme, B, back to the original, A, another contrast, C, back to the original, another one, D, etc., etc. And so as a listener, oh, there's that main theme, there's something different. Oh, we're back to home base, now there's something different again. And so again, this all, when I think of Pratt's work of the 60s and the idea of form, we're looking at something that's very comfortable, somewhat predictable, especially when we get into the gray as color. There's another quote that I think we're going to see. Pratt said in a number of his documents that simple is complex enough. And I love that thought. And that's really an overarching thought of the Viennese era or the classical era that we're talking about here. Okay, let's go on. Any questions or comments as we move into the 70s? Okay, this is where it kind of gets really interesting. Now, in the 70s, he starts looking at geometry and patterns, mathematical progressions made visible as works of art. And this gets really interesting. And so we'll show you a couple of them. He does some geometric patterns that he calls stormy weather and rooftops, and I'm going to show you how these developed. This was really neat for me to learn because one of the permanent pieces at the School of Science and Math is called Stormy Weather, and I didn't really understand how he came up with it, and we're going to show you that today. And then this filling in between the white cycle 2 is a concept of looking at the contrast of white and black numerically, and then filling in the gaps in between in various gradations. Now, one of the interviews that I did, we talked a lot about Pratt being an analog guy. Now, in terms of his promotion as an artist, analog, we're not seeing a lot on the web, but also just in the way he approached art. He didn't have colors that were being mixed by a computer. His colors were being mixed by hands. So as he found these gradations of gray and these ratios of black and white to make gray, they were all done by trial and error mathematically and with great care and attention to the detail. And I think that was one of the great things that I learned over the course of a couple of months of looking at this. Okay, so let's take a look at a number of these. This is, I believe, part of his rooftops theme. I'm just going to go through a couple of these works. This is in the warehouse. There's some plastic over it, but it does give you a feel for the geometric pattern. It's black and white. There are no other colors represented. There are a couple of these pieces that are different sizes. I think this is part of the rooftops theme. And when they all get put together, it looks like, like the outline of rooftops, but they really grow from a more geometric background, which I'll show you in just a second. This is really neat. So this is the upper left-hand corner is somewhat like the final product, and this looks a lot like his heavy weather theme. Now, what he did was he took all of these various patterns that you see on the bottom and matched them and put them together in various patterns. And let's see. He talks about, might be the next one. He calls this the weather series. And I think if I go to the next one, yeah, this actually makes it a little more clean and clear. Where he has the line, you can see the arcs from the top right to the lower left. He calls that 1, then lower left to top, or top left to lower right. you can see what 1, 2, 3, 4, all the arcs. Then he has the next set of arcs, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then a series of straight lines, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then a series of jagged lines, 13 through 16. And then he comes down and he numerically starts working, and he puts different numbers together. I cut a few off there, but there was 1 and 1, and then he has 1 and 2, and then 1 and 3 as he labeled his designs within the box. And then he starts very methodically putting these boxes together to come up with the various things that you see in the black. So for almost all of these works, there's some kind of a numerical working out of the system, and then there's the product. And there's usually several trial and error increments and mock-ups along the way. So what we're seeing here, this to me is the scales, right? This is doing the rudiments that have to be done in order to get to the end product. And it represents to me a very system-oriented artist, somebody that was interested in being very pattern-oriented and system-oriented and come up with these complex patterns. Let me show you just a couple more things. This actually is very similar to what I've brought today. This is the numeric mock-up of this. Okay? So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. Okay? So this is one of the pieces that just grabbed my attention in the warehouse because I thought it was so cool. It's all grays, and many of his pieces, or many, I guess, are done on this sort of burlap-looking canvas, like the one in front of you here. But if we take a look at this, what he does, and this is, again, what just grabbed me as a teacher at School of Science and Math. In the middle, you'll see the number 1 and 1025. 1 would represent white, and 1025 would represent black. If we go there, you'll see right there, the white and the black, the extreme contrast. Now, here we have 500, I gotta get my glasses on, it's a little dark back here, 513 and 1025, so right in the middle, and there we have white, a kind of mid-tone gray, and then black. And now we start expanding out with gray as color. As we look at that sum total, we see these images that the way he put the numbers together, they almost look like a positive negative image, and they're all done very mathematically. So if we get to the 4th row up there, what we really have is these numeric equivalencies. If we're right in this area, 1, 257, 513, 769, 1025. If we add 257 and 769, we're going to come up with 125. So now we've got all these kind of great sort of mathematical ideas that are going on. And then they manifest themselves in this kind of geometric beauty, which is really, really cool. And this is cool. Another kind of idea, doing the numbers in different ways to come up with another piece of interest. So I picked this up at the warehouse. This one's sort of skewed this way, 1 and 1025. So this would be our white and black, white, gray, black. And now it starts curving this way so that we've got black here and white here. This one comes all the way around this way in smaller increments, yet smaller increments coming this way. And then we sort of find that moving in different ways. So you're welcome to sort of check it out. I find a lot of pleasure in looking at the numbers and sort of figuring it out, and where was he going and what was exactly happening here. I find this to be almost in some ways just as beautiful as the final products because it's neat to see his system. The piece that's right here, I want to get to because I felt like it would really be helpful. Maybe could we get the lights turned on for a second just to look at that piece. Here's another one of shade progressions. It's a long. This one I think is up over in the exhibit. It's got to be what do you think? 12 feet long, maybe. At least, yeah, maybe 16, and is really fascinating. In our exhibit, we had 3 of these, all with different gradations. Some are even. You'll sort of see before I get to that quote. We'll do that. Let's give this quote. I love this. Go ahead and read. I'll point a few things out. The subject is the concept itself. I require that each work represent the most logical order of all the possible variations of a whole system. Man, I just love that. And the conditions of which are self-evident in the work. This is a little piece of math that I just thought you'd appreciate, even if you don't understand it. And I didn't do this. I went to Dan Teague, one of the really noteworthy math educators in the United States, who's on our faculty, to work this out for me. But this is this, okay? So here's what we have, and I really like this piece. I wish I could ask Vernon about this piece, but I think this is an educational piece, really. So first of all, you can see this canvas is this sort of burlap color. And then you'll see 3 different sets of gradations. And you can really tell down on this end and on the far ends that they're different in what's happening. So if you notice, he gives us the numbers. The top one is 1, 2, 5, 10, 17, 26, 37, 50, 65. So essentially what he does is the number increases by the sum of the previous 2 as he goes. So 1 and 2 is 3, so 2 plus 3 is 5. And then we've got 5, and 5 gets us 10, etc., etc. The bottom one is the opposite of that, okay? And then the middle one is absolutely even increments. So I had Dan take a look at the number sets and give us some kind of equation. And so the first number set, if n is 1, we have 1 times 1 minus 2 times 1 plus 2 equals 1. If n is 2, then 2 times 2 minus 2 times 2 plus 2 equals 2. And then we can keep going. And we've worked out essentially the geometry, our algebra, to make it work. And so we've got all of the various equations to get us to the place. Now, maybe you guys know, I don't think he was doing this. I think he was working with the numbers as they existed. And okay, let's kind of figure this out almost like hands-on. Do you guys have any sense of what might have been happening there?
I'm afraid we weren't born yet.
Yeah, so this is early stuff. So, but I find it fascinating and I find it beautiful. I find just seeing the difference of where the numbers go to be really kind of interesting. So okay, so a little bit of that. Now, what would the musical equivalencies be? Well, to me, these are systems, they're cycles, and they're like orbits. So I've got 2 that I'll point out to you, and I'll be kind of quick with these. The first one is the notion of a rhythmic orbit, and these to me feel very rhythmic. They feel very much like scales. They feel very rhythmic. So I took a course in improvisation at one point, and the teacher of that course talked about rhythmic orbits, and I found it really fascinating. If we're thinking in 4/4 time, where we have 4 beats in a measure, okay, and there are 4 subdivisions to each of those beats. Pretty simple. We call those 16th notes in music. But then, if we emphasize every 5th 16th note, then we get this kind of unusual sort of groove that starts to happen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we get back to home base. Takes a little while, but we get there. So I made this little orbit, and so that demonstrates it, but this, you'll sort of hear it now. Whoops, go back. Here's our beat. Now I'm going to subdivide the beat. Here comes the orbit. Makes you kind of want to dance a little bit, doesn't it? But that's an orbit. That's a rhythmic orbit. Well, jazz musicians will use these to create this really neat kind of groove. And if you understand how orbits work, then it's kind of cool, and it's not that hard to do once you practice. You guys are band guys? Yeah. So really, it's just it's every fifth, 16th note in this case. Okay. Okay. So that's one way. Now, the other way that we think of orbits, if you're familiar with music theory at all, a beautiful thing about music is that it's all it's cyclic, especially in terms of keys and key signatures. So this is what we call the circle of fifths in music theory, and essentially every time we add a sharp to a key signature, we move to the right around the circle of fifths, and every time we add a flat, we move to the left, and somewhere down at the bottom, the flats and the sharps intersect, and it sort of swaps over. So circle of fifths is cyclical, and several composers over the years have jumped into the concept of a cyclical idea and embraced it in terms of their composition. The most notable, and really probably the first one, was J.S. Bach. In the time of Bach, prior to the Baroque era, keyboards were tuned to the Pythagorean tuning system, where everything was essentially tuned relative to A440. So if a harpsichord was tuned to A, it would sound great in the key of A, and kind of just okay in the key of D, one less sharp, and just okay in the key of E, one more sharp. But any other keys, it would sound pretty horrible. So you'd have to either retune if you were changing keys or switch instruments. But in the time right around just before Bach, the concept of an even temperament was created, where they would take the distance of one octave between A to A and divide every semitone, every half step, equally, which created something called even temperament. It created a keyboard that could be played in all keys on the spot. We could switch, switch, switch. And Bach embraced this idea, and he embraced this idea of cycles, and he started writing compositions that would go the whole way around the circle of fifths. And so, therefore, demonstrating equal temperament. And the most famous, and the one that has this in its name, is the Well-Tempered Clavier, which is a little book of piano studies that are not incredibly difficult, but they are incredibly masterful in their composition. And I'll just play you a little bit, and I'll just show you this YouTube video, because it does, this is a little too small maybe for you to see, but it gives all the major themes of each of the parts of the Well-Tempered Clavier. And then we can listen, and one of the things that I love in this particular demonstration, I'm going to jump to, I think it's a little introduction. I'll get right there. So down on the bottom, you can see that we're in the key of C to begin. Although Bach does a lot with the key of C. And so if we were to watch this whole video, and we're not obviously going to, but he moves from the key of C major to C minor, and then from C sharp major to C sharp minor, to D major, D minor, and right on through the cycle. So very much, this interest in cycles is found all through Western art music. And frankly, it's found in visual arts as well. And Vernon Pratt was interested in this as he was going through. And I'm going to stop there so that we can keep moving and get to some of the others. Any questions about the numeric information and the shades of gray of the 70s? Yeah.
So how did you define black as 1025? Like how did?
Oh, that's a good question. I noted in some, it wasn't always 1025. And again, given my disclaimer that I'm not an art educator, I can't speak to if there was a specific reason that he chose 1025. There are some that black is 62 also.
Okay.
So I don't know if he was interested in, I think he was interested in ratios. And so when he was finding, I can't speak with authority on this, but I believe that then he would say, well, how can I, what kind of ratios am I looking to create? Does anyone, Van Dorn, do you know?
I have a suspicion.
Yeah.
That depending on how many fractions he wanted
Yeah.
in, he would choose from 1025 or 60. What did you say?
62, I think, or 64, I can't remember.
So
65.
1024 is a multiple of 2 if you just go 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, all the way up, but you start at 1, you're going to end up with 1025 instead of 1024.
Okay.
Likewise, 65 is one more than 64.
64, so now we're,
Which 2, 2, 2.
which gets us to 64, yeah. And there may be others. Again, I don't know exactly, but I'm sure there could be others as well. Okay, that's a great question. And I think those are questions that I'd like to, now I'd go back and sort of look for that specifically.
But from an artist point of view, mixing those colors, I'm thinking, he did it mathematically,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
He didn't do it by eye and, well, this color is this much lighter or this much darker than that one.
Oh, no, I think it was done mathematically, using the ratios. Van Doren, can you speak to that? Yeah, I think that's absolutely, again, coming back to, this is an analog artist. This is an analog and mathematical idea here, and very specific ratios, and lots of trial and error, and lots of time alone in the studio working out these very specific ratios, okay? Okay, we move to the 80s, and we get to the, what we'll call all the possibilities. This is a quote, this is from, I think this is from a grant proposal. Such a program holds many attractions for those who value logic and orderliness and care about both detail and panorama. Provides a very neat package of symmetry, the last entry being a complement of the first. Now, that's an important thing, because the last entry is essentially the opposite of the first. So if the first entry is a blank white space, the last entry is a completely filled black space, okay? And so now I start thinking about what it means to be in retrograde and different things. So it is a very extended process, but very satisfying. I think that's a misprint. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what, I was dictating this, and I'm not sure what that was supposed to say. And it is comprehensible. But it is satisfying. I don't know. I don't know what it was. I'll have to go back. Send me an email, I'll tell you. So some of the various titles include all the possibilities of filling in fourths, all the possibilities of filling in 3 into 4, all of the possibilities of filling in 16ths, all of the possibilities of stacking 3 by 2. Let's go ahead and look at a couple of these. This is all of the possibilities of filling in fourths. So if you look at the upper, this is a very simple example. Upper left, there are no fourths filled in. Lower right, all fourths are filled in. And now we've got everything that's possible in there. And you'll notice if we took the piece and we divided it on the lower left, upper right angle, we've got essentially a palindrome, right? Or something like that, opposite. It's a negative image, I guess. So there's even a lot to take in right there. Black and white. There's no grays in this either. This is just black and white. And this is like a sketch that later became something else.
Visual permutations.
Yeah, right. Okay, let me just kind of keep cranking. This is one of his quotes: "A sophisticated system of logic explored with minimal means, self-imposed limits of black and white." This is a sketch. All of the possibilities of 3 into 4. And so I think it's 3 colors into 4. So this would be a white, a gray, and a black. And this would be his sketch of that. Okay, I'm going to keep going a little bit. This one is a sketch representation of a very colorful piece, actually. This triangulated piece is in non-black and white, which maybe pulls it away from the others a little bit, but it's reds, yellow, and blue. And it's all the possibilities of 3 into 4 in this triangulated pattern, and it's fascinating to see it in its final product. I'm not sure that I have a picture of it. I'll check and see. This is one that sustained a little bit of damage.
Where is that located?
Pardon me?
Where is that located?
This piece actually was in my exhibit,
Yeah.
and I think it's at the warehouse, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's at the warehouse now. Am I doing okay on time, guys? I'm a little bit after 7. Do I 10 more minutes? Is that about right? After, keep going? Okay. I don't want to overstay my welcome, but if you're finding it interesting, I'll keep going, and I'll try to keep going. This is one that's much more sophisticated, all the possibilities of filling in ninths. Very big piece. I'm going to keep cranking a little bit. These are food for thought for you. Another one, all of the possibilities of filling in eighths, diagonal order. Now that's 1977, so that's fairly early because we're really thinking 80s at this point. But again, you see that same sort of theme. Okay, so those give you an idea of what we're dealing with. And by the way, you'll see lots of this if you go over to Mamandi and see the exhibit. You'll see a lot of this kind of. In fact, I think this one is in the exhibit. So where does my head go? Well, it goes to symmetry and system in classical art music. So there's system all over the place. And I'm gonna share one that really reminds me of him. The first one that I thought goes back to the Baroque era and to the fugue. Because ultimately the fugue is something that Bach was considered the master of, and he would take a little idea, all of the possibilities of filling in fourths, a little idea. And then we would call that little idea in the fugue, it's called the subject. And it's the theme. And then he would spin that subject out in 2 voices, or maybe 3 voices, or maybe 4 voices, to the point where he had worked out all of the possibilities of that particular theme. And it's complex and satisfying in some crazy way, and it ends on one final note. And you go, oh wow, everything was worked out here. That's ultimately what the fugue is all the possibilities of this little subject. So that's one way that I can see the symmetry and system. But the big way is in serialism and the work that was originated by Arnold Schoenberg. Now I asked who knew of his work, and not many of you did. So I'm just going to tell you this. Schoenberg is an early 20th century composer. He's born in the late 1800s and lived to about 1950. And he developed his own system, ultimately. And this system came to be known as serialism. And he said, let's find a new way to think about music. Rather than thinking about it in terms of tonality, like Bach did, or Mozart did, or even Brahms, or Shostakovich, and others who were thinking about key and tonal center and modulations and all the things that we think about in music, Schoenberg said instead, he said, well, we're going to find home base in something called a tone row. And that row of tones is going to include 12 tones that include every single key in an octave, every half step of an octave. And it's not going to sound like tonality as we understand it. So before the next row can begin, you have to play in the order that it's designed every note that's found in a chromatic scale. So this is called the serialism, or the 12-tone system. Now, all of these geometric ideas of Pratt's remind me of the 4 things that you're seeing here. The first row that you're seeing there is just a chromatic scale. The P stands for the word prime. It's just the original idea or subject. And I want to be clear, this can be found in the fugue as well. That would be the subject of the fugue. In this case, it's a chromatic scale. Retrograde would be, the R, retrograde, would be if we take that scale and we flip it this way, right? So this could be a much more complex melody or a much more complex prime, but if we flipped it, it would be the retrograde of it. I is the inversion of it. If we inverted it on the axis of the first note, boom, now we've inverted it. And if you can use your imagination a little bit, you could invert not only on the axis of the first note, but you could invert on the axis of the second note, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. So there's 12 possibilities of inversion depending on what your axis is. And retrograde inversion, of course, is retrograde and inverted, okay? And the other thing we can do with this is we can transpose it. We can move it up, we can move it down by any number of half steps or semitones. So it creates this mathematical complexity that we see in the work of Vernon Pratt as well. And it's, you know, it's a little bit before Pratt's time, but it's all part of, you know, 20th century thought of designing systems, finding new ideas about beauty. And believe me when I tell you, the Schoenberg serialism and 12-tone systems they're a different kind of beauty. I'm going to play a little bit for you here, just so hear it. This is just to show you a little bit of the complexity of serialism. The P there is a prime tone row of Schoenberg's. Then I put it into this matrix that gives you all of the possibilities of that tone row in inversion, retrograde, and transposition. So you can see some similarities there, I think. Just all you have to do is look at that and go, wow, I see how these systems can be worked out in lots of interesting ways. Nowadays, this kind of matrix can be found online, and I can throw a tone row in online, and boom, I get all of those possibilities. Vernon wasn't doing that. He did it. He worked it out on his own. Okay, so this is just a little bit of Schoenberg's suite for piano, a 12-tone piece. So it's 1 minute long. Cool, huh? So that'll give you just a feel for that. There are some other things here that, whoops, let me get back to where I was, that I'll just kind of give you a quick little thing. I think that, and Pratt said this in some of his documents, that some of this figuring out of what he was dealing with and what he was trying to create was a little bit like a chant. And I don't know how many of you have really listened to Gregorian chant, but it's an art form that was passed down orally, and it's single line. It's not complex. This is early music. This is some of the earliest music that we know of in music history. And I'll just give you just a little smattering of a little bit of chant. So I'm just going to go right into a big. So as I was preparing this, I had this playing in the back, and I was thinking about it, and I was sort of picturing Vernon, figuring out those patterns, chant in the background. Because in the end, that's kind of what this is, It's a bit religious too, I mean, this comes from the sacred tradition, and I think there's a little bit of religion in this as well, just a commitment, to finding it. And then I'm going to just show you one other thing, because you can go online and find chants and listen to them all day long. That's 8 hours of chant there. But another thing that these retrogrades and these ideas remind me of, especially when we see it and we know that we see the negative image on the other side, or as it flips. It reminded me of, I love a band called Bela Fleck and the Flecktones from back in the 80s, some Bela Fleck people. So they have an album, about maybe their second or third album, this goes pretty far back, was called UFO Tofu. And it was essentially the title track. UFO Tofu is a palindrome, right? UFO-T-O-U, whatever, yeah. And so what they did was the title track, UFO Tofu, has a couple of musical palindromes embedded into the music. And then the whole idea as a listener, if you're me, listening to Bela Fleck, I've got to hear it. Where is it? And you're searching for it. So we'll give you just a little smattering, and you can go find Bela Fleck's. Well, come on. There it is. A little bit of UFO Tofu. That melodic lick is it's a palindrome. Same forward as it is backwards. And I think this chord progression is too. And it goes back. Well, not yet. Now it goes back. makes for good fun. It's, I think, an artist's way of sort of challenging the listener. Can you find where I found from? And I think Vernon was doing that to some extent. Can you find the pattern? Can you see where I was going with this? And do you see the beauty in it like I did? So I'll leave that at that particular one at that to just check it out. There's another one that I just thought of, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go by it. But Mozart, actually, in the Viennese era, wrote a piece that this violinist could read that way, and on the same piece of music, that violinist could read it that way, and they'd be looking at the same piece of music, and it's an incredible feat. It sounds fantastic. So if you look up Mozart's table music, you'll get something like this. It's brilliant to think that it sounds so great. They're reading the same sheet of music. And one's reading it upside down and the other one's reading it upside right. But to me, it's the same concept, you know. And again, you can look that up. It's Mozart's table music. But it's really the same concept. And I'm going to finish up here with just the last little bit. This was really interesting as I talked to colleagues, and there are a number of these pieces that look something like this, that have just a couple of words. And the words sort of are, again, variations or development of the same letter system. In this case, feel, fear, dear. And so there's a relationship between the words. It's quick. And one person said, I think the wordplay pieces are like jazz. They're quick. They're like a little improvised solo that didn't take very long, but could just kind of get a quick idea out. I was talking with Trinity over at the warehouse the other day, and she told me that the studio that Vernon worked out of for years was called Art Rat Tar, right, in Durham. And so his business cards had Art Rat Tar on it. And my guess is, and it's only a guess, but I guess he was walking into that studio every day, Art Rat Tar, and then these other words would start cropping into his mind. Feel, fear, dear. Over here, you can see all kinds of stuff. And almost all of these words find their way into much smaller pieces elsewhere that are more like 2 or 3 words. Flaw, feel, love, sin. Flee finds its way in a lot. Fall. Tra-la-la, I love. From tar, Art Rat Tar, probably grows from that. And I've got a couple of these images. Feel and flee is one. I think that one's over at the warehouse, perhaps. I'm not sure. Weird, art, mill, wet. Again, I would equate these, at least from the little bit that I've been able to figure out from some conversations, I would equate these to a quick improvised jazz solo, which brings us back around full circle to John Coltrane and to this love of jazz. And to me, these are riffs. They're not the chant and the scale study of the numbers. They're not the arduous working out of the subject that we find in the geometric works. They're quicker. They're ideas. They're ideas that are on his mind that particular day or that particular week. And but I think they're brilliant. I love the little word plays, but they're lightweight. Yeah.
In the word art, then, did he go back to color? Because a couple of those had color.
Yeah.
So did he in the 90s bring color back into his?
Trinity and I definitely noticed at the warehouse that when we get back into the later part of his life, that there's a lot more color reintroduced into his work at that time, and whether that's built on having kids. I think Trinity can tell great stories about kind of tagging along on different things, and I'm sure there's lots of those. But that's certainly part of the idea. They're improvisational ideas, and I hope that's right. Of all of the connections that I've made, that's really one that just feels that way to me. It's not like I really got it from that. I guess maybe I did hear it from a couple of the folks I spoke with, but that kind of brings us around full circle. Now, I want to be clear. This isn't everything. There was, later in his career, there was a lot of three-dimensional stuff. There were huge towers where he started taking systems, and now instead of being 2D, now they become 3D. There were sculptures. There, of course, is the education wall here in Raleigh, which is another large period of Vernon Pratt's creative life, and there's a lot there too. I don't know as much about that, so I didn't really want to speak to it today. Are there any questions that I can answer for any of you, or any ideas or thoughts that you want to mention? I'd like to, I'm going to just beg your indulgence for 1 second, because I made a couple of notes of things I just didn't want to miss, you know? And I feel a lot of responsibility today. So let me just make sure. These are some quotes that I heard from friends. You know, it's more interesting to look at his paintings when you know him as a jazz musician. I thought that was an interesting quote that I wrote down. He found beauty in math. I think we've made that clear. That there were multiple mock-ups of every painting. By the time he got to the actual final work, it was really pristine. It was already done at that point. And I think that was an interesting thing. Oh, the grayscale idea came from his West Coast training. I grew to learn. A lot of attention was given to light, and he learned color by mixing color. Color mixing was his scales as a musician. I love this one. Rigidity of numbers. He was always finding this tension between the rigidity of numbers and the freedom of improvisation, both his improvisation as a musician and as an artist, and I think that's interesting. And he liked to keep his foot in both worlds, that of improvisation and classics. Guys, I hope everyone can walk away a little smarter after that, and know a little something about Vernon Pratt. Thank you. I appreciate your time and attention today. Trinity, I know would like to say a word to everybody.